My past two talks were on natural law and natural rights. And in the natural rights talk, I was explaining how really they're one and the same. It really comes down to the true moral law given by Jesus, which is to love comprehensively. And that is also a law against abuse, because the verb form of love, befriending, loving action, the opposite of that is abuse. So, again, what I observe over and over and over again is people believing that there's some exception to this rule. And then when people believe that and follow that, it leads humanity into a bad place. So, another example, besides the excuses or supposed exceptions of, it's for safety, or, it's for the greater good, the utilitarian / communist view. Besides that very common one being widely disseminated and unfortunately followed, there's also this common idea that some abuse is okay, again, for the greater good, in particular when the way that they'll word it alternatively from the safety argument or greater good is they'll say it's a social responsibility. So they'll say violation of individual rights to some degree is acceptable because it's your social responsibility, right? So again, this is false morality. It's this virtue signal nonsense, that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And the way that they're doing this is by conflating something real, like the reality of true social responsibility, which would just be in keeping with the greatest commandments, in the teachings of Jesus, where he clearly does call on us to, help people in distress, no matter who they are, even if they're of an opposing religion, and he gave examples too of helping animals, when they're in distress. So he definitely encouraged us to have true social responsibility, which is basically love of the other, right? The essence of real social responsibility, you could say, is being loving towards others, right? Keeping others in mind, not just completely ignoring them or abusing them, right? So that's true and that's good. But what they're saying is that abuse from the state is one and the same with this social responsibility. That basically an extortion racket, a group of people who commit extortion just to focus on their foundational and continuous abuse and not even, get into the atrocities of state-sponsored terrorism, genocide, democide, wars, bombings, killing countless civilians, and torture, and just all the atrocities committed by governments for centuries, including the torture and murder of Jesus himself, right? They're conflating that group of people with a role or duty of social responsibility. It's a false equivalency. They're not one and the same. And I'm not the first person to recognize this false equivalency, this conflation. For example, the very famous author Peter Kropotkin. This is what he wrote in an essay titled the state, its historic role. So this is an excerpt from that essay. Quote, "First of all, let us be agreed as to what we wish to include in the term the state. There is, of course, the German school, which enjoys confusing state with society. The best German thinkers, and many among the French, are guilty of this confusion, because they cannot conceive of society without a concentration of the state. And because of this, anarchists are usually accused of wanting to, quote, destroy society, end quote, and of advocating a return to, quote, the permanent war of each against all, end quote." He goes on to say that a state, in contrast to just society by itself, is, quote, a territorial concentration as well as the concentration of many functions of the life of societies in the hands of a few. It carries with it some new relationships between members of society which did not exist before the establishment of the state. A whole mechanism of legislation and of policing has to be developed in order to subject some classes to the domination of others. This distinction, which at first sight might not be obvious, emerges especially when one studies the origins of the state, end quote. So in case you didn't quite get what he was saying with that last statement, he's saying the distinction between just society, meaning people on planet Earth, living on various continents, in towns and villages and so on, society, versus the state. The distinction can be made more clear when you look at, well, how do states come into being, right? And then you see all of this violence and force, right? And establishment of their rule over populations, right? It's not just society. Another author, this being current author, Gerard Casey, wrote about this same issue of this false equivalency between society and government, and therefore also including this issue or topic of social responsibility, right? So I'll now read from his book, Libertarian Anarchy Against the State, a book I highly recommend you read. So in this section titled "Constitutions Are Not Contracts," the author, Gerard Casey, is criticizing the analysis of Edmund Burke, which is oftentimes referenced as supposedly a good example of a good explanation on why government really is one and the same with society. But he explains that it's basically just a bunch of rhetoric and assertion without any argument. He says specifically, quote, "Shorn of its rhetoric," meaning, if you take the rhetoric out of it, shorn of its rhetoric, however, it appears to be entirely devoid of argument, amounting to a bare assertion that there is a great primeval eternal contract that demands our obedience. He goes on to say, "The best that can be said for the passage is that it contains a tacit pragmatic appeal to much the same fear that one finds at the root of Hobbes' Leviathan, namely that without the state chaos ensues," end quote. And he says further down, quote, "Of course, there are status relationships operative in our lives that are simply given to us and are not a matter of choice. The primary locus of such a status relationship is the family. But it is a fundamental mistake, a mistake repeatedly attempted, to portray the ideal political order as a family writ large," end quote. So just as the false equivalency is oftentimes asserted that, government is just society, or it's just social responsibility manifest. There's also this spoken and sometimes just implied um, idea, which is also another false equivalency, that the government is really like our family or our parents. So he says, quote, "The problem with Burke's position then is that if it is to have any plausibility at all, it can have such only by confusing the civil order with its multifarious forms of status relationships with the political order," end quote. So just to clarify that, when he says confusing the civil order with its multifarious forms of status relationships, he's talking about um, the order found in, say, a family, or other sort of naturally occurring grouping of people that isn't based on coercion. And that's not the same as a political order, which is based on coercion, and namely extortion, right? Extortion is like, I think the right term to use here is linchpin, or, it's the key element that people just keep ignoring, like as if it's insignificant, but it's like the defining characteristic of government. It's the group of people that extort other people. It's the group of people that commit extortion against other people and call it taxation. That's very distinct from, a family or just society as a whole. So just to sum this up and simplify it again, there are people trying to convince populations at large that accepting extortion from a certain group of people is actually good because it's just you exercising your social responsibility. As if the only way that you could help other people, right? That's what society is, right? It's other people out there in your neighborhood, your town, wherever. The only way that you can help them is to accept extortion from some people who are historically the most violent people in the world and have committed the most murder and atrocities out of anybody. That's how you exercise your social responsibility. That's what they want you to believe. Right? It's false. So once again, false morality by false gods is the number one problem, like the title of the talk I gave a while back. True morality, again, is comprehensive love, which is also the non-abuse principle. Right? Aggression, deception, and theft are forms of abuse. The end. No exceptions, no asterisks. And so basically what the enemy, if you want to think of that in a spiritual context or social context or both, keeps doing is this form of deception to make you think that abuse is sometimes okay, that there are these exceptions, like I said, if it's for safety, or if it's an emergency, right? Or if there's a war, or, if they say it's equivalent with social responsibility, right? All just kind of subterfuge, all deception, just to distract you from the fact that the extortion is a form of abuse, and abuse is always wrong. That's really what it comes down to, and if that was understood, we could have avoided, so much of the pain and suffering caused by states throughout history. People just recognize that they're a counterfeit on social responsibility. They're a counterfeit on, parents. They're a counterfeit on authority, right? God is the true authority, and Jesus gave us the authoritative truth. And people keep getting deceived to look elsewhere and believe these logical fallacies that support abuse. All right, thanks for listening.